See, I really like the psychoanalysts. And I like the idea that you have a psyche that's inside of you and that is structured in partly consciously and in part unconsciously. There's something about that that's really cool, and I've learned a lot from the psychoanalysts. But, you know, there is a funny consequence of thinking the way they think, and you do think the way they think, even if you don't know it. Like, we tend to think that a lot of us is inside our head. You know, that's the psyche model, basically. But the more I've practiced as a clinical psychologist, the less I've actually been convinced that that's true. So I could say, well, let's say I want to know about your personality. We think, well, I want to know you. I want to know about your subjectivity. I want to know what's inside of you. But that isn't actually what you do want to know if you're doing clinical work, say, with someone. You want to know, do they have any friends? That's really important, because if you're miserable and anxious and badly placed in life and misbehaving, one of the reasons that all of that can occur is because you don't have any friends, you don't know anyone. And that's not something that's inside you. It's you localized in a broader sphere. And then you might say, well, do you have a job? And, well, let's talk about the job. Do you actually make enough money with your job? Is it satisfying for you in any way? Are you bullied all the time when you're at work? Does it provoke anxiety? Is it a career that allows you to go somewhere? Are you overworked? Well, but let's start with just the first question. Do you have a job? Well, if the answer to that is no, you have a serious problem, and that might be to depress you and make you anxious and hopeless and nihilistic and all of those things. And you could say, well, you're not reacting very well to not having a job, but that's kind of a foolish objection, even though some of it might be true. One problem is that you're not reacting very well to not having a job, but another problem is that you don't have a job, and that actually constitutes a problem, right? You don't get to eat. You don't have a place to live. Those aren't psychological problems precisely, even though a psychological problem could make it worse. Well, are you as educated as you should be? That's another question. How do you handle drugs and alcohol? Are they taking you down a bad pathway? You know, what about intimate relationships? Do you have one? Do you have a plan for one? Or is that a never-ending series of catastrophes or something that you avoid completely? That's a big problem. And maybe people aren't attracted to you for one reason or another. And you could think about that as a psychological problem, but it's an interpersonal problem. And the degree to which that's a psychological problem is certainly unspecified when you first begin to talk to somebody. What about your family? Do you have a family? Because it's hard to be in the world all by yourself, that's for sure. It makes things a lot more stressful, even though having a family can also be extraordinarily stressful. You know, do you have plans to have children? How are you doing with your parents? Do you get along with your siblings? You know, all of that, to me, is more fundamental, and it's outside of you. Those are elements of your experience, more broadly conceptualized, more than they are objects of your psychology or of your internal experience. You know, it's sort of like, well, a person is a creature that exists at multiple levels of analysis, right? Something might go wrong with you at a cellular level, so maybe you're born with a genetic abnormality, so something's wrong with you molecularly, or you have something wrong with a major organ, or maybe there's something wrong with you psychologically, or maybe you're in a pathological family, or maybe you're stuck in a pathological social system. And figuring out why you're suffering means going up and down those different levels, trying to specify the appropriate level for analysis and also the appropriate level for intervention. And for me, as I've said, even though I'm a great admirer of the psychoanalysts, and I do things like dream analysis, which I really find incredibly useful and enlightening, the fundamental level of analysis is, well, what's your experience structured like exactly? And that isn't localized in you. Now, the behaviorists do that too, because it's one of the things I really like about the behavioral approach to psychotherapy. It's very, very concrete and practical. It's like, they'll say, well, there's certain things that you need to have in order to live properly, and maybe you don't have the skills or the wherewithal to accumulate them, and we'll break them down into tiny little pieces and you'll practice. So, for example, with someone who doesn't have any friends, then you do a microanalysis of their social skills, say, and maybe an analysis of the kinds of anxiety that are stopping them from going out and meeting people, and then you address those things practically one by one. You try to get the person to have some friends, you try to figure out how they can establish an intimate relationship, you see if you can help them sort out their family, you do what you can about their employment, and A lot of that's only tangentially related to, really in some sense, to the structure of their psyche. But one of the things you'll see if you work as a clinician or as a counselor is that most of the time people come and see you because they have problems, not because they have psychological problems. And those things are not that easy to distinguish. You know, it's sort of the psychoanalytic idea is sort of like, well, if you just got your act together, everything would work out for you. It's like, yeah, there's some truth in that. But you know, if you're 55 years old and you've just been laid off work, and maybe through no fault of your own, it isn't obvious how much getting your act together is going to help you find another job, because the actual problem that you're facing may have relatively little to do with you. And that would especially be the case if you're maybe on the bottom half of the intelligence distribution, for example. And so it isn't as easy for you just to go out and pick up new skills at the drop of a hat, you know, and that gets harder as you get older because your IQ actually declines quite substantially as you get older. The working or the fluid intelligence part anyways, exercise can keep that at bay, by the way. It's the best way to keep that at bay.